They voted to exile humanity. We smirked, shut the door, and never looked back. The hall was enormous, so enormous that the sound of a single chair scraping against the floor could travel all the way to the curved ceiling and come back down again like a whisper. And on most days, that kind of silence made the species gathered inside feel important. It made them feel like what they were doing mattered. But on this particular day, the silence felt like something else. It felt like the moment before a hammer comes down. The Galactic Conclave had been meeting in this hall for over 400 years. The walls were made from a pale stone that came from a dead moon in the Vethan home system. The chairs were carved from materials imported from 11 different star systems. And the great circular table at the center was wide enough that if you stood on one side, the delegate sitting across from you looked small, like a figure seen through the wrong end of a telescope. 131 species sent delegates to this hall, some of them ancient, with civilizations stretching back so far into history that they had watched young stars form and burn out, some of them newer, still proud and loud about their recent discoveries, all of them powerful in their own way, and all of them on this particular morning were staring at the same spot. They were staring at the human delegation table. Ambassador Yara Soli sat alone at that table. She was a woman of medium height with dark hair pulled back tight, and a jacket that was pressed so cleanly it looked like it had never been worn before today. She had a stylus in her right hand and a thin data pad on the table in front of her, and she was not looking at the other delegates. She was not looking at the grand podium where the Vethan patriarch stood. She was looking at the surface of the table like she was reading something written there that no one else could see. The Vethan patriarch was tall. His species was always tall, with pale gray skin and 4 arms that he kept folded in a way that was meant to signal authority. He had been speaking for nearly 30 minutes already, and he showed no signs of stopping. His voice was the kind of voice that filled a room without effort, the kind that had been trained over decades to sound reasonable even when it was saying unreasonable things. "The record will show," he said, "that humanity was extended membership to this conclave 47 years ago. At that time, many of us expressed concern. Those concerns were noted and then set aside in the spirit of inclusion. Today we are here because those concerns were not simply valid. They were warnings that we chose not to hear." He gestured toward a display screen that rose from the center of the table. It lit up with a list, a long list, and each item on the list was a complaint, a grievance, a case filed by one of the member species against humanity over the past 4 decades. The Cathari delegate had filed 14 complaints, most of them related to humanity reverse engineering Cathari biological technology without going through the proper licensing channels. The Cathari were proud of their biotech. It was the foundation of their entire economy, and they had spent centuries building the frameworks that governed how it was shared and sold. Humans had looked at those frameworks, nodded politely, and then gone home and figured out how to do the same things themselves from scratch. Technically legal, deeply offensive. The Uran Collective had submitted a complaint about an incident that had taken place at a formal ceremony 3 years ago. One of their elder speakers had passed away, and the conclave had held a traditional eulogy. It was a long ceremony by human standards, nearly 6 hours, with ritual songs and recitations that the Uran considered deeply sacred. Near the end of the ceremony, a junior member of the human delegation had laughed, not a loud laugh, just a small, involuntary sound. But the hall had been silent, and everyone had heard it. The Uran had never forgotten it and had never fully forgiven it. The list went on: trade disruptions, protocol violations, refusals to follow standard navigation agreements on shared hyperspace lanes. Each item was small on its own, but together they painted a picture that the patriarch was very clearly trying to paint, the picture of a species that did not fit, that did not try to fit, that perhaps did not want to fit. Humanity, the patriarch said, represents a category of unpredictability that this conclave was not designed to accommodate. They do not follow shared agreements in spirit. only in the narrowest technical definitions. They treat galactic law the way a child treats a fence, not as a boundary to respect but as a puzzle to solve. They are, in the most diplomatic language available to me, ungovernable. There was a murmur around the table, a sound that moved through the hall like a wave. Yara Solis clicked her stylus once. She did not look up. And so, the patriarch continued, this council has been asked to vote on a formal motion. The motion is as follows: that humanity's membership in the Galactic Conclave be revoked in full, that all access to shared hyperspace lane agreements be terminated, that all trade network privileges extended under the membership charter be suspended indefinitely, and that Earth and all human-occupied territories be reclassified as non-member, non-affiliated space. He paused. The hall was very quiet. The floor is open for final statements before the vote. What followed was 2 hours of speeches, 131 delegates, and nearly half of them wanted to speak. Some were brief and formal, reading from prepared statements with the flat voice of someone who had made up their mind long ago. Some were passionate, describing humanity as a threat not just to the conclave, but to the idea of galactic civilization itself. A few were almost apologetic, saying things like, "This is not what we wanted, and we bear no ill will toward the human people," before voting for exile anyway. Yara Solis sat through all of it. She wrote nothing on her datapad. She clicked her stylus occasionally, a slow and steady rhythm like a heartbeat. She did not ask to speak. She was not required to under the rules of procedure, and she did not volunteer. When the last delegate finished, the patriarch called for the vote. The votes came in through the electronic system. Each delegate pressed a panel on their section of the table. The results appeared on the central screen in large, clear numbers. 131 in favor of exile, 1 against. The 1 against was humanity's own vote. Yara Solis had pressed her panel without hesitation, without drama, without looking up. "The motion carries," the patriarch said. His voice was formal, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded almost like relief, like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had finally been allowed to set it down. "The exile of humanity from the Galactic Conclave is hereby recorded and enacted. Ambassador Solis, you will be given 30 standard minutes to collect any personal items before your access credentials are revoked." Yara Solis set her stylus down on the table. She picked up her datapad. She stood up slowly, and she buttoned the top button of her jacket with 2 fingers, a small and precise movement. She looked around the hall once, not desperately, not sadly, more the way a person looks around a room they are leaving for the last time because they want to remember what it looked like. And then she looked at the patriarch directly. She did not say anything grand. She did not deliver a speech. She did not make a threat or a promise or a dramatic declaration. She said 2 words. "Noted," she said. And then she walked out. The door was large and heavy and made from the same pale stone as the walls. It closed behind her with a sound that was not loud at all. It was soft. It was the kind of sound a door makes when it is pulled shut by someone who is not angry, not sad, just done. The hall was quiet. 3 delegates began speaking at once, filling the silence with procedural language and next steps and formal announcements. But the Kethari Admiral, Vessel Commander Smirked, who had been sitting in the observer's gallery above the main floor, was not listening to any of them. She was watching the door, and she was thinking about the expression she had seen on Yara Solis's face in that last moment before she turned to leave. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was not the look of someone who had just lost something important. It was the look of someone who had just been handed exactly what they wanted. Smirked did not say this out loud. She wrote nothing down. She simply sat with the thought, quiet and careful. The way you sit with something that you are not sure you fully understand yet, but that you know, somewhere deep and certain, is true. They voted to exile humanity. We smirked, shut the door, and never looked back. The conclave economists published their first report 6 months after the Exile vote. The report was long and detailed and full of charts. It was written in the careful, confident language of people who are very sure they are right. The main conclusion was printed in large text at the top of the summary page. It said, "Without access to shared hyperspace infrastructure and conclave trade networks, human-occupied territories face economic collapse within 8 to 12 standard years." The report was distributed to all 131 member species. Several of them printed physical copies, which was unusual because most conclave business was handled digitally. But there was something satisfying about holding a physical document that confirmed what you already believed. It felt solid. It felt like evidence. They waited for the collapse to begin. It did not begin. 3 months after the report was published, a mid-sized human cargo vessel failed to arrive at the Kethari way station on the edge of the shared hyperspace corridor. This was not unusual, because the Exile meant humans were no longer allowed to use the corridor. But the station logs showed the vessel had been scheduled before the Exile, which meant someone had forgotten to cancel the routing, a minor administrative error, the kind that happened all the time. What was unusual was what happened to the way station 2 weeks later. The station's water recycling system, which had been slowly failing for about a year, stopped working completely. The Kethari maintenance crew filed an emergency request with the conclave's shared maintenance network. The network logged the request and assigned it a priority level. The priority level meant that a repair crew would arrive in approximately 14 standard weeks. 14 weeks without functional water recycling on a deep space way station was a serious problem. On the 9th day after the system failed, someone fixed it. Not a Kethari crew, not a conclave maintenance team. The station's external sensor logs showed a small, unregistered vessel docking at the service port during a 6-hour window in the middle of the night cycle. By the time the morning crew came on shift, the recycling system was running better than it had in 2 years. The mystery crew was gone, and sitting on the console in the maintenance bay was a small piece of paper, actual paper, which almost no one used anymore, with 5 words written on it in standard galactic. "You looked like you needed help." No signature, no registration number, no way to trace where the vessel had come from or where it had gone. The station commander filed a full report with the conclave. The report included the sensor logs, a photograph of the paper note, and a careful description of the repair work, which the station's own engineers described as technically proficient and somewhat showing off. The report concluded with a recommendation that the incident be investigated. The investigation found nothing. 6 weeks later, something similar happened in Uran space. The Uran Collective occupied 3 star systems and had a population of about 9 billion. They were a quiet species, thoughtful and formal, with a culture built around long-term planning and deep respect for process. They were also, in a way that they never spoke about publicly, in serious trouble. The Uran food supply chain relied on a network of processing machines that converted raw agricultural material from their colony planets into stable, long shelf-life food products. These machines had been designed with help from human engineers 12 years ago, not because the Uran couldn't have designed them alone, but because the humans had offered and the price had been reasonable and the timeline had been faster. The machines worked well, until they didn't. The maintenance protocols for the machines required a specific type of calibration component, a small, unremarkable piece of hardware that had to be replaced every 2 years. The component was manufactured at a facility in human space. When the Exile vote passed, the supply of those components stopped. The Uran had a 4-month stockpile. They had expected to find an alternative supplier within that time. 4 months passed. They did not find an alternative supplier. The components were not complicated, but they were precise, and every manufacturer the Uran contacted either couldn't meet the specifications or couldn't deliver fast enough. The machines began failing one by one, quietly, in the way that infrastructure fails when it is not being properly maintained. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly getting worse. The conclave's official response was to commission a study on alternative food processing solutions. The study was expected to take 2 years. On a Tuesday morning, humans had exported the concept of Tuesday to about 40 species over the decades, and it had stuck. A convoy of 12 unregistered freighters arrived at the Uran's main distribution hub. The freighters were carrying calibration components, enough to service every machine in the Uran network for the next 3 years. They were also carrying something else, a new version of the component, redesigned, with a longer replacement cycle of 5 years instead of 2, and full technical documentation, so the Uran could manufacture them locally going forward. The convoy docked, unloaded, and left. No crew member made contact with Uran officials. The only communication was a brief automated message sent to the hub's receiving system. It contained no ship names, no company names, no human identifiers of any kind. It said only, "Delivery complete. Documentation is in the second crate on the left. Good luck." The Uran Elder Council met in emergency session. The meeting lasted 9 hours. At the end of it, they sent a formal inquiry to the conclave asking whether the Exile decree prevented them from accepting goods from human sources if those goods arrived without official documentation. The conclave took 3 weeks to respond. The response was yes, technically. The receipt of undocumented goods from exiled parties constituted a violation of the exile terms, but enforcement would be at the discretion of individual member species. The Uran read the response carefully. They filed it in the official record, and then they kept every single component and used every single one of them. They said nothing more about it publicly. In the observer gallery of the conclave's main chamber, Vessel Commander Smirked sat through a budget session and thought about none of the budget. She was thinking about the pattern, because she was the kind of person who saw patterns, who had spent her career reading the behavior of ships and fleets, and translating that behavior into intent. And the pattern she was seeing now was not the pattern of a species in collapse. It was not the pattern of desperation or scrambling or reaching out for help. It was the pattern of a species that had decided, very deliberately, to demonstrate something. They were not begging. They were not negotiating. They were showing. And what they were showing with every quiet repair and every anonymous delivery was not need. It was capability. It was the very calm, very deliberate communication of a simple message. We can help you and we don't need anything from you in return. We are doing fine. We were always going to do fine. Smirked requested access to the conclave's long-range sensor archives. She spent 2 weeks going through the data. She was looking for human ships, not the ones that had been regularly logged on shared lanes before the exile, but the others, the ones that had appeared on the edges of sensor range and then disappeared, the ones that had been logged as unidentified, non-threatening, no response to hail, and then forgotten about. She found dozens of them. They went back years, not months, not the period after the exile, years. They had been there long before the vote, moving through uncharted corridors, taking routes that didn't appear on any conclave map, going places that no one had thought to look at. Smirked sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the archive room for a long time. Then she pulled out her personal log and wrote one sentence. They were never lost, they were mapping. They voted to exile humanity. We smirked, shut the door, and never looked back. The probe was a standard long-range survey unit, the kind the conclave sent out automatically every few years to monitor the borders of known space and make sure nothing interesting was happening that the Council should know about. It was not a military vessel, it had no weapons, and it was not expensive. It was the galactic equivalent of a camera mounted on a pole pointed outward into the dark. This particular probe had been assigned to monitor the edges of human-occupied space, a task that, before the exile, would have been considered unnecessary because humans were members and their space was shared space. But the conclave's new policy required regular surveillance of non-affiliated territories, and human space was now the largest non-affiliated territory in the known galaxy. The probe was gone for 11 months. This was normal. And when it returned and docked at the conclave's relay station for data extraction, the technicians who processed its information had what would later be described in the official report as an unexpected finding. Most of the probe's data was corrupted. This was not normal. Probes occasionally lost data, but the corruption on this unit was widespread and strange. It was not the kind of corruption that came from a hardware failure or a collision with debris. It looked more like the probe had passed through something, some kind of field or energy that had scrambled its systems in a very specific way. The engineers who examined the probe spent 6 days trying to understand what had caused the damage, and ultimately wrote in their report that they were unable to determine the cause. But not everything was corrupted. One image had survived intact, a single frame from the probe's visual sensor array, captured at a distance of approximately 40,000 kilometers. The image showed a structure. It was dark against the darker background of deep space, so at first glance it was easy to miss, but the probe's sensors had highlighted it automatically because it was large, very large. The preliminary size estimates, based on the sensor data that had survived, put it at roughly the diameter of a small moon, maybe 200 kilometers across. But it was not a moon. Its shape was too regular, too deliberate. It had geometry that nature did not produce. It was a ring. Not a perfect circle, more of an irregular polygon, many-sided, with each side a flat panel of material that the sensors could not identify. At the center of the ring was nothing, just empty space. But the probe's gravity sensors, in the brief moments they had functioned before being scrambled, had recorded something strange about that empty center. The gravity readings did not match what they should be for empty space. They matched what you would expect to find at the mouth of a folded spatial corridor. A gate. The conclave had gates, had been using gate technology for nearly 2 centuries. But conclave gates required enormous infrastructure. 3 anchor stations positioned in a triangle formation, a fleet of maintenance drones running continuous calibration, a dedicated power relay system that needed to be serviced every 40 standard days, and the involvement of 17 different regulatory bodies before a new gate could be activated. The smallest functional conclave gate took 9 years to build and required the coordinated effort of at least 4 member species. This structure appeared to have none of that. No anchor stations, no visible maintenance drones, no external power relays, just the ring, sitting alone in the dark, radiating nothing that the probe could identify, pointing toward a region of space that did not appear on any conclave chart. The image was classified immediately. Only senior council members and their top advisors were given access. But in a council of 131 species, nothing stayed classified for very long. Within 2 weeks, the image had been seen by enough people that suppressing it further would only draw more attention to it, and so it was quietly entered into the restricted archives and discussed behind closed doors. The discussions were not calm. The Vethan Patriarch convened an emergency technical committee, a group of the conclave's best engineers and physicists, drawn from 8 species. He gave them a simple task: determine if what the probe had photographed was actually a functional gate, and if so, how humanity had built it. The committee met for 3 weeks. They analyzed the image from every angle, ran simulations, consulted historical records of experimental gate technology, and argued with each other extensively. At the end of 3 weeks, they presented their findings. The structure was, with high confidence, a gate. The gravity readings were consistent with an active spatial fold. The technology used to build it was not consistent with anything in the conclave's knowledge base. It was not an evolution of existing gate technology. It was something different, not better or worse in a simple sense, just built on entirely different principles. As if someone had been given a description of what a gate was supposed to do, and had then gone away and figured out how to do it from scratch without using any of the existing methods. A junior researcher on the committee, a young Cathari woman named Veen, who had only been working in the field for 4 years, raised the question that no one else wanted to raise. "How long do you think it took them to build this?" she asked. The committee chair, a veteran Vethan engineer, said the honest answer was that they didn't know because they didn't understand the construction method. "But based on the material weathering in the image," Veen said carefully, "and the debris pattern around the structure, which suggests it has been sitting in that position for some time, I think it has been there for at least 4 years, possibly 5. The room was quiet. 4 to 5 years ago, humanity had still been a member of the conclave. They had still been sitting at the great circular table, filing their paperwork, attending their sessions, being lectured about protocol violations and trade agreement infractions. And at the same time, somewhere out in the dark, they had been building this. "What's on the other side?" someone asked. Nobody answered because nobody knew. The probe had not gone through the gate, and even if it had tried, its scrambled systems would not have been able to report back effectively. What was on the other side of a gate pointing toward uncharted space was, by definition, unknown. Vessel Commander Syrth had been given access to the full committee report. She read it twice. Then she pulled out the timeline she had been building privately for the past several months, the one that tracked humanity's movements, their acquisitions, their seemingly random behaviors going back 15 years. She added the gate to the timeline, and then she sat and looked at the whole picture. The resource acquisitions from 12 years ago, bulk purchases of raw construction materials that no one had thought twice about because humans were always building something, the exploration missions that had mapped uncharted corridors, the way they had quietly learned everything the conclave could teach them, and then stopped asking questions, not because they had lost interest, but because they had learned enough. The fact that their ships had been operating on routes that didn't appear on any shared map for years before the Exile. She requested a meeting with the Patriarch. He received her in his private office, which was decorated with artifacts from a dozen civilizations and smelled like the incense that Vethan burned during formal occasions. She placed the timeline on his desk, and she walked him through it without rushing, without dramatizing, just point by point. When she was finished, the Patriarch looked at the document for a long time. "You're saying they planned for this," he said. "I'm saying," Syrth replied, "that they planned for something, and I don't think it was Exile specifically. I think it was independence. I think they looked at the conclave 15 years ago and they made a decision not to leave, not yet, but to be ready to make sure that when the time came, for whatever reason, they would not need anything we had." The Patriarch was quiet. "The Exile," Syrth continued, "may have been exactly what they were waiting for, not because they wanted to be exiled, but because it gave them a clean reason to stop pretending they needed us. They voted against the motion. Ambassador Solis pressed that panel, but I don't think she was surprised when it passed. I think she walked out of that chamber knowing exactly where she was going next." The Patriarch looked at the image of the gate, which Syrth had printed and attached to the back of the timeline. "What do you think is on the other side?" he asked. "I think," Syrth said, "that we should be more concerned with that question than we currently are." She left the document on his desk and walked out. In the corridor outside, she paused for a moment and looked at the pale stone walls of the conclave building and thought about all the years those walls had stood, all the decisions made inside them, all the species that had sat at that table and believed that the table was the center of everything. Then she walked on. They voted to exile humanity. We smirked, shut the door, and never looked back. 5 years after the vote, on a morning when the conclave's main chamber was in the middle of a routine session about navigation fee adjustments on the northern hyperspace corridor, Every communication terminal in the building chimed at the same time. It was not a scheduled broadcast. Unscheduled simultaneous transmissions on all conclave frequencies were extremely rare. They happened during emergencies, during declarations of war, during announcements so significant that the sender needed to make absolutely certain every receiver was listening at the same moment. The last time it had happened was 22 years ago, when a rogue asteroid had been detected on a collision course with a populated system, and the evacuation alert had needed to go out instantly to every ship and station in range. So when the terminals chimed, every delegate in the chamber stopped talking. The delegate from the Morith sovereignty had been in the middle of a very long sentence about corridor fee brackets, and he stopped halfway through a word. There was a moment of complete silence, and then every screen in the room showed the same thing. A ship. It was sitting at the edge of conclave central space, specifically at the boundary marker that separated member territory from unaffiliated space, sitting there calmly, not moving, not approaching, broadcasting on all frequencies simultaneously. It was a small vessel, not a warship, not a freighter. It was sleek and dark and shaped in a way that was clearly functional rather than decorative. It had no visible weapons. It carried no flag or symbol that any of the delegates recognized. It was simply there, quiet and still, like a person who has knocked on a door and is waiting patiently for someone to open it. The transmission began without introduction, no identifying header, no formal opening address, no use of the standard conclave communication protocols that every member species had been required to follow for centuries. Just a voice, calm and professional, speaking in standard galactic with a clarity that suggested the speaker had prepared these words carefully and was not going to rush them. This is a courtesy message from the Terran Sovereign Compact. The chamber was so quiet that several delegates heard their own heartbeats. We want to be clear about a few things. First, we are not applying for re-entry to the Galactic Conclave. That process is closed, and we have no interest in reopening it. Second, effective immediately, we are formally designating the space adjacent to Conclave member territories as a non-engagement corridor. This means that Terran vessels operating in those regions are there for transit or assistance purposes only and should not be considered a military presence. We will not initiate contact with Conclave vessels unless they initiate contact with us. Third, we wish the Conclave and all its member species no harm. We carry no grievances. We are not angry. We are simply no longer involved. This channel will not be monitored after this transmission ends. A pause, 3 seconds, maybe 4. The kind of pause that feels longer than it is because everyone listening is holding their breath. And then the voice continued, and the tone shifted, just slightly. It was still calm, still professional, but there was something underneath it now, not arrogance exactly, but the particular quality of someone who is choosing to share good news because they feel like it, not because they owe anyone anything. The gate is open. By the way, we finished the calibration sequence about 8 months ago. We have accessed 16 new star systems through the corridor. 3 of those systems contain habitable planets. 2 of the 3 are already being surveyed for settlement. The third one we are going to leave alone for now, because it is genuinely beautiful, and some of our people feel that putting a colony on it would be like writing on a painting. Another pause, shorter this time. One of the 16 systems contains ruins, structures of non-biological origin. Preliminary dating suggests they predate your conclave by approximately 2 million years. We don't know who built them yet. We are working on it. It has been a productive few years. The transmission ended. For approximately 4 seconds, nobody in the conclave chamber said anything. Then everyone said something at once. The Vethan Patriarch stood up so fast that his chair slid back and hit the delegate behind him. He was pointing at the screen showing the human ship and demanding that a response be sent immediately. The communications officer tried to explain that the transmission channel had already gone dark, as the message had said it would. The Patriarch told him to find another channel, any channel. The communications officer tried 4 different frequencies and got no response from the vessel. While this was happening, the Morith delegate was on his feet arguing that the compact's designation of a non-engagement corridor was legally ambiguous and potentially a provocation. The delegate from the Ulleth Federation was quietly taking notes and not saying anything. The Kethari senior representative was standing very still with his hands clasped behind his back and a look on his face that suggested he was doing difficult mathematics in his head. The ship sat at the boundary marker for exactly 12 minutes after the transmission ended, long enough for every sensor array in Conclave's central space to get a thorough scan of it, and then it jumped a clean, fast FTL departure. No warning signal, no pre-jump communication, no standard 30-second countdown that Conclave navigation regulations required, just there, and then not there, leaving nothing behind but a fading drive signature that the tracking systems lost within 2 minutes. The scan data was processed in the next hour. The results were distributed to senior council members and immediately caused a second round of arguments. The vessel's hull composition was unfamiliar, not exotic, not impossible, just different from anything in the Conclave's materials database. The drive signature of its FTL jump matched no known propulsion system. It was not the standard warp compression technology that the Conclave used. Not the fold drive technology that 3 of the oldest species had developed centuries ago. It was something new, something that the analysts described as operating on principles we can identify in theory but have not implemented in practice. Smirked was not in the chamber during the transmission. She had been in the Conclave library, which was in a separate building. She heard about it from a junior aide who ran across the courtyard to find her, slightly out of breath, talking fast. She listened without interrupting. When the aide finished, she asked one question. Did they mention which of the 16 systems had the ruins? The aide blinked. No, they didn't give coordinates for any of the systems. Smirked nodded slowly. Of course they hadn't. Why would they? The whole point of the message was not information transfer. The whole point was to establish, clearly and without drama, exactly where things stood. They were not enemies. They were not gone. They were simply elsewhere doing their own things, and they were fine enough that they could afford to drop by and mention it casually as a footnote at the end of a diplomatic transmission. 2-million-year-old ruins, she thought about that number. The Conclave considered itself ancient, 400 years old, proud of its longevity. The Vethan civilization stretched back 9,000 years, and they spoke of it with great reverence. 2 million years was a number that made 9,000 years feel like last Tuesday. And humanity had found it, stumbled through a gate they built themselves into uncharted space, and found a civilization so old it had risen and fallen, and turned to stone before the Vethan had learned to light a fire. The next morning, the Uran Collective sent a formal document to the Conclave. It was not a resignation, not yet. It was a request for clarification. Specifically, the document asked whether the Exile decree, as written, prevented member species from initiating diplomatic contact with the Terran Sovereign Compact under their own authority, independent of Conclave involvement. The legal team took 4 days to respond. The response was, technically, no, the Exile decree prevented humanity from accessing Conclave-specific infrastructure and trade networks. It did not prohibit member species from pursuing independent bilateral relationships. The drafters of the original motion had not included such a prohibition because, at the time, they had not believed it would be necessary. They had assumed that without the Conclave's backing, no species would have reason to seek out humanity independently. The Uran read the response, filed it, and sent a second document the following week. This one was addressed not to the Conclave but to the Terran Sovereign Compact, transmitted on an open frequency that everyone in Conclave's central space could see. It was brief, formal, and very polite. It requested the opening of trade discussions at a time and location of the Compact's choosing. The Conclave chamber was less noisy when this happened. The noise had not gone away, it had just changed character. It was quieter now, more careful, the sound of people who are starting to understand that the situation they are in is different from the situation they thought they were in, and who are trying to decide what to do about that. They voted to exile humanity. We smirked, shut the door, and never looked back. 10 years after the vote, the Galactic Conclave still existed. This was worth noting because there had been a period around year 7 when several analysts had predicted it would not. It had survived, but it was not the same as it had been. The great circular table now had empty seats where 7 species had once sat. The Uran had been the first to leave, quietly and without ceremony, submitting their formal withdrawal, and then simply not attending any further sessions. 4 others had followed over the next 2 years, each for their own reasons, though the reasons tended to share a common thread. They had found it more useful to talk directly to the Terran Sovereign Compact than to work through the Conclave's layers of procedure and committee review. The Conclave still functioned. There were still 124 species at the table, still sessions, still agreements being negotiated, and disputes being resolved. But the empty seats were visible, and the hall felt different. It was hard to say exactly how, but people who had been attending sessions for decades said it had the feeling of a house that used to have more people in it. The Terran Sovereign Compact in the same 10 years had become something that the Conclave's political analysts kept trying to categorize and kept failing. They tried calling it an empire, but that wasn't right because it had no emperor and no conquered territories. They tried calling it a federation, but that wasn't right either because the member groups within it did not behave like a federation. They behaved more like a very large, very loud family that argued constantly and somehow always ended up moving in the same general direction anyway. The best description anyone managed was the one that an older Cathari scholar wrote in an academic paper. The compact is not a political structure. It is a relationship. And like all relationships, it is held together not by law but by the ongoing decision of its members to keep showing up. It had grown, not just in human terms but in every sense. The 7 species that had left the conclave had all established formal ties with the compact, not as subordinates or clients, but as partners. Some of them had contributed to the Gate project, sending their own engineers through to help survey and study the 16 new systems on the other side. 2 of them had established small settlements on the habitable planets alongside human colonists. The ruins in the 7th system had become the most significant archaeological project in known history, drawing researchers from 9 different species, all working together in the organized chaos that tended to happen when humans were involved in a project they were excited about. The station where the compact held its first open summit was built in orbit above the planet that no one had wanted to put a colony on, the beautiful one, and from the observation decks, you could look down and see why that decision had been right. The planet was covered in enormous forests of gold and red, the colors so vivid they looked almost artificial, and the oceans between the continents were a deep blue-green that shifted depending on the angle of the light. It was the kind of view that made people stop, whatever they were doing, and just look. Vessel Commander Syrth had retired from the Conclave's Observer Corps 2 years earlier. She had been given an invitation to attend the summit as a private guest, not in any official capacity, and she had accepted because she was curious, and because she was old enough to have decided that curiosity was the best reason to do almost anything. She had expected the station to feel grand and formal, diplomatic summits usually did, but it did not feel that way. It felt busy. There were people everywhere, moving quickly, talking loudly, carrying things, arguing about things, laughing about things. She passed a room where 3 Cathari engineers and 2 humans were standing around a table covered in technical diagrams, all of them talking at the same time, and somehow the conversation appeared to be productive. She passed a corridor where an Uran diplomat was sharing a meal with a human child, who had apparently decided that this person was interesting and had sat down next to them uninvited. And the diplomat, rather than being offended, was showing the child a small puzzle made of interlocking metal rings. She found the observation deck after about 20 minutes of walking. It was quieter there, most people preferring the interior rooms where the food and the conversations were. And she found, standing at the viewport looking down at the gold and red forests below, a woman she recognized immediately despite the gray at her temples and the 10 additional years on her face. Ambassador Yara Solis was older, but she was still unbothered. That was the only word Syrth could find for it. There was a quality to the woman that had nothing to do with age or position, a quality of someone who had long ago decided what they thought about things and had not been significantly shaken by anything since. She was wearing a jacket, pressed clean, the top button done up, the same as she had been on the day she walked out of the conclave chamber. Syrth crossed the deck and stood beside her at the viewport. They looked at the planet together for a moment without speaking. Solis did not seem surprised to see her. "I didn't expect to find you at a summit like this," Solis said. Her voice was the same too, calm, not unfriendly, carrying the particular tone of someone who means exactly what they say and nothing more. "I was curious," Syrth said. "I wanted to see what you had built." Solis glanced at her sideways. "It's not really what I built. I was one person. It's what a lot of people built because they wanted to." "You started it," Syrth said. "I walked out of a room," Solis said. "That's not the same as starting something. The something was already there. It was already happening. It just needed the room to stop being the center of it." Syrth thought about that. She looked down at the forest below, at the light shifting on the ocean. She thought about the timeline she had drawn up years ago, the one that laid out humanity's quiet preparations, their careful mapping of the dark, their long game played behind the face of a member species that was always arguing about protocol violations and laughing at the wrong moments. "Did you always know it would end up like this?" she asked. Solis was quiet for a moment, a real moment of quiet, not the kind people use to make an answer seem more thoughtful, but the kind that happens when someone is actually thinking. "No," she said. "We knew we would be fine. We didn't know what fine would look like. That's the honest answer." "Were you not afraid at all?" Syrth asked. "When the vote passed, when you walked out, were you not afraid even a little?" Solis looked at the viewport, at the planet, at the stars beyond it, at the deep dark between them where the gate was, and behind the gate 16 new systems, and behind those 16 systems whatever came next, which no one knew yet. "I was afraid the recycling system on that Kethari way station would be too complicated to fix in 6 hours, she said. "It wasn't, but I was worried." Syrth laughed. It came out before she could decide whether to let it a short, surprised sound, and Solis smiled, the same small smile, the unbothered one, the one that had been sitting on her face in the conclave chamber for the last 30 seconds before she walked out the door. They stood together at the viewport and watched the planet turn slowly below them. Through the transparent wall they could see the edge of the station's structure, and beyond it the curve of open space, and beyond that, faint, impossible to make out with the naked eye, but there, if you knew where to look, the faintest suggestion of the gate, hanging in the dark between the stars, pointing outward. A new human ship passed the viewport while they were standing there, heading out, heading toward the gate. It was a survey vessel, not large, bristling with sensor equipment, and carrying what were probably a dozen researchers arguing loudly about methodology and destination priorities. It moved with the comfortable speed of something that knew where it was going. It did not slow down, it did not turn. It passed the station and kept going, steady and purposeful, toward the gate and through it and into whatever waited on the other side. It did not look back. Nothing that was going somewhere ever did.